everyone. There we go. Yes, I am back. So today what we are going to do, we are going to discuss the female hormonal cycle. And bear with me a minute while I get my proper, let's see, why don't we make the brain blue? Does that work for you? All right, so hopefully you have reviewed the male hormonal cycle because that will make learning the female hormonal cycle all the more easier. So as you know, this part of the brain is called the hypothalamus, and it is directly over the pituitary glands. How does the female hormonal cycle start? It starts when the hypothalamus senses low levels of sex hormones. This should remind you exactly of the male cycle because it starts off the same way. Instead of sensing low levels of testosterone, we're in the female, so the hypothalamus is going to sense low levels of estrogen and progesterone. In response to the low levels of sex hormones, the hypothalamus is going to secrete GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And hopefully you remember that there is a direct capillary bed. So actually there's a capillary connection between the female brain and the anterior pituitary. And these little hormones, these releasing hormones, go right from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. So this should exactly remind you of the male cycle so far. In response to sensing low levels of sex hormones, the hypothalamus releases GnRH, and GnRH travels directly to the anterior pituitary. Now we're going to change things up a little bit. Let's see, what color should we use now? How about green? In response to gonadotropin releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary releases FSH, and only FSH at this point in the female's hormonal cycle. So FSH travels throughout a woman's bloodstream, but the target cells are in the ovary. So right here, this represents one great big huge ovary. So follicle stimulating hormone, it travels through the woman's bloodstream, but the target cells are in the woman's ovaries. Specifically, the follicles. So what do you think follicle stimulating hormone is going to do? You might say stimulate the follicles, and you would be correct. So FSH stimulates the follicle cells to do two things. One is to mitose. Two is to produce one of the female sex hormones, estrogen. All right? So, to review, follicle stimulating hormone circulates all throughout the woman's blood. Its target cells are in the ovary, specifically the follicles. It stimulates the follicle cells to grow and to produce estrogen. Now this is going to represent exponential growth, where we have one cell, it will mitose into 2, then 4, then 8, then 16. So this follicle is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger with time. And eventually, we'll talk about this in a minute, this little follicle will be a huge follicle. All right? And there's also, there's supposed to be little follicle cells around the ovum. That would be smaller, but I didn't draw that very well. All right, one thing that, again, these follicle cells are secreting estrogen, and one thing the estrogen does is stimulate that ovum to mature. But the estrogen also goes into the woman's bloodstream, and the woman has estrogen receptors all over her body. So one thing estrogen does in the human female, it stimulates the development of her secondary sex characteristics. So when we were talking about the male, reviewed secondary sex characteristics. So these are characteristics that she develops when she first hits puberty. So this would include breast development, gaining that what's called an hourglass figure, extra layers of fat, makes her skin softer, and also prepares her body for a possible pregnancy. In fact, a woman will not cycle unless she reaches a certain level of body fat. Another thing the estrogen does as it circulates throughout the female's body is it stimulates the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, to thicken. Again, to prepare for a possible pregnancy. So there you have it, believe it or not, so far. This is the first part of the woman's cycle. All right, during the first part, and I say first part, I don't say half, because this phase, which in your notes you'll notice it's called the follicular phase, is highly, highly variable woman to woman. And so that's why I just say it's the first part of the cycle. But this is what's going on. FSH is being secreted in low levels. It stimulates the follicle cells to mitosis and to produce estrogen. So as the follicle cells mitose, the follicle itself gets bigger and bigger and bigger until finally we have a huge, huge, huge follicle. Now, as this follicle has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the egg, let's change my color here for dramatic emphasis, all right, the egg has been getting riper and riper and riper and riper. So when we have this huge, huge, huge follicle, that's supposed to be the word huge, sorry about that. Huge follicle, and this is supposed to be the word follicle. When we have a huge, huge, huge follicle, that equals a ripe egg. Oh, there you go. Lovely, lovely, lovely handwriting. All right, let's take a closer look at this huge, huge, huge follicle. If we were going to graph the number of follicle cells over time, you would have where you had one follicle cell would go to 2, then 4, then 8, then 16. And this would again apply to all the cells in the follicle. What you would have is an exponential growth of the number of follicle cells. So here, this represents time. This represents the number of follicle cells. And once again, there's a critical size here. When you get to a critical number of follicle cells, that is indicating to the woman's body that she has a ripe ovum. Yeah, you see those invisible words here, ripe ovum. Now, here's the problem. Can the woman's brain look down and look into her ovary and say, oh, look, there's a ripe follicle. That's a huge follicle. It's ready to burst. No, of course not. The woman's brain cannot look down and see this huge, huge, huge follicle that's ready to burst out. But can you figure out what the hypothalamus can sense? Well, think about it. If the number of follicle cells are growing exponentially with time, and if the follicle cells are making estrogen, then you could correctly assume that the estrogen levels, the blood estrogen levels, are also increasing exponentially with time. Now, can the woman's body sense a peak level of estrogen? Absolutely. And again, this is exponential growth. So one day you might have a medium-sized follicle and a medium amount of, let's say, estrogen, and suddenly, boom, the next day you have this huge ripe follicle and peak level of estrogen. So this is a critical point of the female cycle because we have matured one egg and we want to release only one egg. So pay special, special attention what happens next. When there is this peak level of estrogen, this peak level of estrogen simultaneously does two things. Number one, this peak level of estrogen exerts negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Why is this so important? Well, think about it. We are about ready to pop out this one egg. There are other follicles racing to be egg of the month. We don't want the second place and the third place runner, if you will, to cross the finish line. We don't want a silver and a bronze medalist. We have the gold here ready to pop out. Right behind are other follicles. We do not want those follicles to burst because we only want one baby, not two, not three. So once we have one ripe, this huge follicle makes enough estrogen to exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Simultaneously, this peak level of estrogen exerts positive feedback on the anterior pituitary. Now, this will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release its other gonadotropic hormone, its other hormone that goes to the gonads, that stimulates the gonads. Do you remember what the two gonadotropic hormones are that are released by the anterior pituitary? They were FSH and LH. So the hormone that's going to be released mid-cycle is LH. But before we write it down, I want you to remind you of something else. In endocrinology, the bigger the stimulus, the bigger the response. We have this peak level of estrogen here stimulating the anterior pituitary, so you should expect this big response. And this is exactly what happens. In response to this peak level of estrogen, the anterior pituitary releases this huge, huge, huge surge of LH, luteinizing hormone. And this huge, huge, huge surge of luteinizing hormone is directly what triggers ovulation. This pounds on the right follicle and causes the egg to pop out. So let's draw that. We'll go back. We have this huge, huge, huge surge of LH, and that causes the egg to pop out. And that's called ovulation. So it's mid-cycle here. Okay, I'm going to draw the empty follicle. Hopefully you're with me so far. Maybe I'll review what I just said. A huge follicle meant we had a ripe egg. The follicle cells are producing estrogen. So this peak level of estrogen signaled to the female's body, we have a ripe egg. So this peak level of estrogen simultaneously exerts negative feedback on the hypothalamus and positive feedback on the anterior pituitary. In response to this peak level of estrogen, if I wanted to draw it out for you, what happens is that the anterior pituitary releases this huge, huge, huge surge. We'll try it again. This huge, huge, huge surge of luteinizing hormone. And this is directly what triggers ovulation. All right, so now what happens is this egg, it shouldn't still be in the ovary, it pops out, right, goes down the fallopian tube. The woman's body is a great recycler. After the egg has left the follicle, the empty follicle fills in by a process of cell division. Do you want to guess whether it's mitosis or meiosis? If you guessed mitosis, that would be a really good guess, because we don't want to create another ovum. All right, so this empty follicle is filling in by the process of mitosis, and I used yellow deliberately because for whatever reason, when the empty follicle fills in, the cells are yellow. And it forms a structure that you will see on the PowerPoint called a corpus luteum. I'm just going to abbreviate it as CL, but on the PowerPoint, it will be called a corpus luteum. It literally means yellow body in Latin. Corpus, corpse, that's like a dead body. Luteum, well, I never took Latin, but I've heard that this means yellow. So, yellow body. The corpus luteum is an endocrine gland, believe it or not. And the corpus luteum secretes the other female sex hormone. Let me erase my little diagram over there so we can have some more room. Or we don't need this anymore. I thought I was erasing it. Oh yeah, I'm erasing it. I started to erase it. New technology. Now, why am I erasing it sometimes and not others? Well, I think I erased enough of it. All right. The corpus luteum makes the other female sex hormone, which is progesterone. Okay? All right, now what you've learned a while ago is that estrogen and progesterone are the female sex hormones, and they are both made by the ovary. But what you might not have known until now is that it's the follicle cells that produce estrogen when the egg is maturing, and it is the corpus luteum that produces the progesterone. In other words, the first half of the female's hormonal cycle is estrogen dominant. The second half is progesterone dominant. All right, so what happens with progesterone? Progesterone circulates throughout the female's body, and it too promotes the development of the secondary sex characteristics. Progesterone, it too thickens the endometrium, but now, hey, game on. There is an egg out there, it might be fertilized soon, so it really, 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 really thickens the endometrium. And you'll remember with estrogen, it started off in low levels because the follicles were really little. But the corpus luteum, when it's made, it is naturally big. So when progesterone is made, it is secreted in a high amount right away. And this high level of progesterone continues to exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus.
Why is this important? Well, we just popped out one egg. We want to see if it's fertilized before we go maturing another egg. So as long as there's negative feedback on the hypothalamus, it won't stimulate the anterior pituitary to release FSH. So the last half of the woman's cycle is wait and see. We have an egg out there. Will it be fertilized? Will she get pregnant? Wait and see, wait and see. All right, this story can have two possible endings. Should we make the woman get pregnant or not get pregnant? What do you choose? Well, hey, when I ask this in class, my female students yell, not have her get pregnant, not have her get pregnant. So I guess we'll do that scenario. All right, if the woman does not get pregnant, the corpus luteum is genetically programmed to self-destruct in 2 weeks. So again, it forms midway in the cycle, often on day 14, after ovulation. And then it is genetically programmed to self-destruct in 2 weeks if there's no pregnancy. When the corpus luteum self-destructs, is it making progesterone anymore? No, it is not. If there's no more progesterone, then progesterone is not exerting negative feedback on the hypothalamus. And there hasn't been a developing follicle for a while. So when the corpus luteum self-destructs, the sex hormone levels are now low. No high levels of progesterone or estrogen. When sex hormones are low, two things happen. One, there is nothing supporting the endometrium. Sorry, I didn't need to read that out anymore. Since there's nothing supporting the endometrium, it sloughs off and the woman has her menstrual flow, her menses. And what happens when you have low levels of sex hormones in the blood passing through the hypothalamus? The hypothalamus senses the low level of sex hormones and here we go again. The cycle starts all over again. So I hope this was clear. What you should do now is I have a PowerPoint presentation in which I go over the same information. But I think it helps to see it in picture form before you hear it as a PowerPoint. And then what I would do to study it, find a friend who owes you a big favor and tell them the story of the female hormonal cycle. Because when you understand this, there's some really, really neat implications that we can discuss, but only if you truly understand it. I'll see you in the next video.